Hey guys, this is Robbie Avalos with RPP. Welcome to part 2 of this webinar on pitch design and pitch development. During this webinar, we're going to go over a pitch-by-pitch review, cover a wide variety of topics to help improve players' overall movement patterns. So let's get into it. Here is a brief outline of what we'll be covering in part 2. In part 2, we're going to go through pitch by pitch and give a general outline of what each looks like from a movement standpoint. I should also say that all movement charts are presented from the viewpoint of a right-handed pitcher. Here is a four-seam fastball in slow motion. In each of these videos, we slow it down at the point of release. So pay close attention to how the fingers create the spin axis for each pitch. This is the movement data on the four-seam we just watched. 6 inches of horizontal and 17 inches of vertical break, and a 40-minute spin axis on the Rapsodo hour clock. So basically, the pitch broke slightly in and arm side on a right-handed pitcher. This would be somewhat typical of how a four-seam behaves. The blue circle represents approximately the general area we would expect a four-seam to move. Every pitcher is different, so a sidearm guy might very well end up outside this blue circle. Here is a two-seam fastball. With a two-seam, we want to make sure that it moves differently than a four-seam. I say that because so many young pitchers don't know how to correctly throw one. A two-seam is supposed to be just slightly slower in velocity than the four-seam, move more horizontally to the arm side, and have a little less vertical lift on it. Now let's take a look at the movement chart for my two-seam fastball. As we noticed, the horizontal break did go up and the vertical break did go down. My spin axis also went up to about an hour and 34 minutes. Spin axis is very important for these two pitches. I usually like to have a minimum increase of 30 minutes on these two. Now here we have the four-seam and the two-seam side by side. Look at how the four-seam has top-down rotation. Essentially, I'm trying to pull it straight down. Whereas on the two-seam, I'm trying to go top right to bottom left. In turn, differentiating the spin axis, which will create different movement for these two pitches. Now here's a video of a changeup. On a changeup, we want to make sure it's outside the horizontal movement of the four-seam, but does not necessarily have to be outside the horizontal movement of the two-seam. I personally like to get as much arm side run as possible, but as long as we are outside the movement of the four-seam, we're in a pretty good spot. Now, as we look at the movement chart on the changeup, you can see that we increased the spin axis to about 2 o'clock, making the horizontal break increase, the vertical break decrease, bringing us closer to that horizontal line. Let's quickly go over the three pitches we just saw. Look how they are distinct and different. Four-seam, two-seam, and changeup can and should move differently from one another. This is how high-level throwers tunnel their pitches and create deception with maximum relative movement. Here we have a video of a slider. Notice how the spin axis and efficiency become way different. What we like to look at on this pitch is the spin efficiency. Around 30% is good on a slider. This will be the closest pitch to a gyro ball. Also, a spin axis around 9 o'clock is what we are going for to create that gyroscopic pitch. The spin axis on a slider is not as relevant as our other pitches. And remember, since we have low efficiency on this pitch, there is not a ton of movement in relationship to the gyro ball, and most of the spin of this pitch will be along the y-axis. Here's the slow-mo video of my cutter. As you can see with my grip and hand placement, I was pretty heavy on the outside of the ball, but I'm still pulling down through it pretty hard to create a lot of backspin. I'm at 49% spin efficiency, which I was happy with, and I want that backspin because I want to create a decent amount of vertical lift. Like I mentioned in the last slide, I wanted to create a cutter with a decent amount of vertical lift. So having the axis at 11 o'clock is exactly what I was going for. With that, I was able to create 9.5 inches of vertical movement over 5.5 inches of horizontal movement. Here we have a slurve. This is a pitch that we see a lot of high school kids actually throw. It's because they don't really have a true slider or a true curveball, so they're somewhere in between. As long as we're throwing this, we want to create a lot of movement, so the efficiency will be above the slider but less than a curveball. The spin axis on this slurve was 844. I also increased my efficiency in comparison to the slider because I want to create as much lateral break as possible, trying to turn this into a swing and miss pitch. Remember, the axis on this will be less than the slider but more than the curveball. Here we have a video of a curveball. Notice how compared to the slurve, the efficiency is way up, the vertical break is way up, and the horizontal movement is way down. This is what I mean by a more true curveball. Here is the movement chart for the curveball. Look at how much the vertical break has increased. The more depth, the better. When we're throwing a curveball, we want the spin efficiency high and we want the vertical depth to get as deep as possible. Let's quickly again review these 4 pitches and their relative movements. Here are all the pitches we have reviewed in the webinar on one movement chart. The circles highlight the general locations of movement for these pitches, but obviously every pitcher is different. A sidearm pitcher could completely fall out of these general areas of movement on some or all of his various pitch types. Be sure to follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at RPP_performance. That was the end of part 2. Let's head on over to part 3 to continue this presentation.